Welcome back to Apatros Review. In this episode, the D Spectrum 4, Part 2. Now welcome back to Apatros Review. Now this is the second part of a 3-episode special called the D Spectrum 4, the 4th installment of the series where I recount the worst films I've reviewed in the Apatros Review so far, between the 75th and 100th episodes. Because I've had more than 10 films that fall in the D Spectrum, in other words films that score less than average rating, such as a D+, 3 out of 10 meaning it's disappointing, a D, which is a 2 out of 10 meaning it's bad, and the dreaded D-, 1 out of 10 meaning it's atrocious. I don't do F ratings. In the past 25 episodes, this will be a multi-part episode. Also, this is the first time I stretch out to 3 episodes. For each film, I'll do a brief recap of the film's story and why I gave it that rating. In the case of an Australian DVD release, I will also mention what label released it and what general condition of the disc. And so it goes on the second part of this review. The First He Did. Directed by Terry Becker in the year 1974. I gave this a D+. It's disappointing. Not currently available on DVD in Australia. 4 women living in Manila, in the Philippines, have been abducted by hired goons and taken to a village oasis hidden on the mountaintop, where a secret immortality cult have been living for the past 500 years. The cultists, who worship the still-living severed head of their founder Raul, encased in a glass box filled with blood, use the blood extracted from their chosen donors and mix it with a plant sap taken from nearby sacred plants to create an elixir that will keep them from aging, granting them impractical immortality, on the condition that they never leave the oasis. One of the new arrivals is prophesied to be their new high priestess, but the candidate respectfully refuses the offer and decides to lead her fellow captives to escape, aided by the remorseful high priest. One of those tacky exploitation films that American filmmakers used to make in Manila during the 1970s, Roger Corman did a lot of business there at the time, and which were destined to be screened at the local drive-in. The First He Did was a sole theatrical film made by TV actor Terry Becker. The film has since gone into obscurity, although some current labels have been reviving the film with restoration prints appearing for the likes of Mill Creek, this is also my review copy, Something Weird Video, and Vinegar Syndrome. While the film's plot holds a good deal of promise, the execution is seriously half-assed, to the point that the film is slow as hell and fairly boring, making it something of a drag. The cast, including TV veteran John Constantine as the cult's high priest, man, he must have had done something to appear in this schlock, do their roles of conviction despite the silly material they've been given, and aspires to use makeup effects look passable enough, particularly that severed head that the cult worships, which only has one line of dialogue. There's been a lot of reviews claiming that the sets in this film look like something out of the original series of Star Trek, and those people are pretty much on the money with this one. The cave sets do look like they've been recycled for Star Trek, which would have been off the air for about 5 years or so at the time, and the costumes are truly awful. The First He Did doesn't have much going for it, but for a PG-rated film that lacks graphic violence, profanity, or even nudity, this is a pretty safe bet for family viewing on Halloween night. Although the little tykes watching this might get the giggles watching the various cult rituals on the side of the severed head. Also, this cult appears to be the most friendly, least threatening cult ever depicted on the screen, although leaving them is literally a death sentence. The cult's oasis is ringed by a boundary that causes anybody who has taken the elixir to age rapidly to the point of death. By the way, what do they pay these goons to supply them with fresh blood donors? They don't appear to have any sort of money on them, do they? Not currently available on DVD in Australia, although you can import either the Mill Creek Pure Terror Collection or the Vinegar Syndrome DVD. A Nightmare on Elm Street, directed by Samuel Bay in 2010. The remake, not the original. My grade D+, disappointing. This was released in Region 4 by Warner Home Video. It is always a dicey proposition to remake a film, even more so when the original film is an esteemed classic of its genre, in particular the 1984 horror classic A Nightmare on Elm Street, a low-budget horror film that ended up creating the horror movie icon of the red and green sweater and fedora-wearing child killer Freddy Krueger, who wears a razor glove and attacks his victims in their dreams, cracking jokes and one-liners as he dispatches each victim in various inventive ways that, for the most part, feature some cracking good visual effects, as far as the 1980s practical effects were capable of. No CGI in those days. The film ended up being a surprise hit and earned its place as a top horror franchise in the 1980s, even though most of the sequels weren't exactly good enough to outgun the original in either acting or plot. This 2010 remake was a controversial film to say the least. When it came out, and yes, I did see this one during its theatrical run, fans were either divided between those who loved the remake and those who absolutely hated the film, and were scathing at producer Michael Bay and his Platinum Dunes company. It's track record of putting out mediocre remakes of classic genre material in order to make an easy, profitable milking fans nostalgia for all it was worth. For me, this 2010 remake of Nightmare on Elm Street was very, very disappointing in many respects, but surprisingly good in others. For the record, even though he's not Robert Englund, Jackie Earle Haley made an impressive Freddy Krueger. Even though his CGI-enhanced Burns makeup resembled something you would get if you invited one of those Na'vi aliens from Avatar to your neighborhood barbecue and the Na'vi mistakes your grill for a fire spirit and tries to worship it, only to get too close to scorch its face off in the process. In a voice that sounds too close to Christian Bale in full Batman mode while suffering the advanced stages of lung cancer. The production values here are very high, resulting in a very slick-looking movie. Michael Bay has his faults, but he certainly doesn't scrimp on the budget. Those two things are the only two things that prevent me from giving this film a D-, because without them, this film is certainly one of the most unnecessary and just plain awful remakes I've had the misfortune of watching projected on a cinema screen. The faults of this movie are astounding. First off, while many non-horror fans will hate the fact that the original Freddy Krueger was a child killer, everybody, both horror fans and non-horror viewers, will hate the fact that writers Eric Heiser and Wesley Street decided to turn the character into a pedophile. While I do have to acknowledge that Wes Craven's original intention was to make Freddy Krueger a child molester when he was writing the script for his 1984 classic all the way back then, but realized that it would result in box office poison and decided to change it to simply being a child killer. It is still a very bad move to have one of the most recognizable horror film villains in movie history become something that is considered in today's society as virtually untouchable. It also presents the filmmakers a whole new set of problems in the writing stage. In real life, anybody who has been molested as a child never forgets the experience, no matter how young they were when it happened to them. It's not something you easily forget, so how in the frigging heck did the parents here manage to suppress their memory so effectively? Also, it seems a touch cruel to split up the preschool students' friendships just to keep them from remembering their pasts. These parents have done some pretty stupid things to their children. Next up on the problems front are the micronaps, an invention of the writers that has very little basis in reality, and were put in simply to allow the monster to attack its victims whenever he liked. This also kills the basic concept of the whole story to the point that the rules have been seriously messed with, resulting in a film that has no concept of keeping its own rules. The original film also broke its own rules, particularly in that atrocious ending it had to evoke sequels with, but that's something I'll explain when I cover that film one day, and thus destroying the internal logic considerably. Also, when a remake with 2000-era CGI technology gets outgunned by a 1984 original which used almost entirely practical effects, except for that part where Krueger walked through a jailhouse door in the original, which was achieved by trick photography, a very old type of effect. You have to wonder why they even tried to do it in the first place, and by that I mean reworking the original effects CGI here. I hate the majority of CGI effects. I grew up on practical effects and those things look realistic enough. No matter how cheap the effects looked, at least they were there. Unlike the CGI crap of today where that when they do appear, you know precisely that they were cooked up on somebody's computer. No artistry in that. And the decision to replicate the opening credits twice at the same time was a very poor one. Even though director Samuel Bayer is known as the king of 1990s music videos, given he's worked on so many classic ones in that decade, he doesn't quite have the stylistic or technical resources to make this film any good. And by the way, this was Samuel Bayer's only film. The only things that prevent me from giving this otherwise very poor remake a D- are the surprisingly impressive performance of Jackie Earle Haley as Freddy Krueger and the rather slick look of the film. But that is it. This film gets a D+, 3 out of 10, makes it about the level of being mediocre. This was released on the DVD and Blu-ray by Warner Home Video. The technical quality of the disc is pretty good, but the limited number of supplemental features on the disc, only one feature and not even a good one of that, really pisses off the DVD tragics like me. Now, Surface Air, directed by Rodney McDonald in the year 1998. I gave this one a D+. This was released in Region 4 by Flashback Entertainment and Brand Multimedia. Surface Air was one of a large number of modestly cheap B-action films that Royal Oaks Entertainment had made during the mid to late 1990s, usually with an eye towards the promotion of the US military with a staggering amount of rather impressive stock footage of US military hardware in action, from surfacing submarines to warplanes taking off from hangars and aircraft carriers, and also having the main characters usually being members of the US Armed Forces. In this case, we have a pretty mediocre B-action movie that doesn't really do much to make itself seen as anything other than a candidate for the video store crowd in the 1990s, to rent a VHS for a night relaxation or for light rotation to some small television networks at the time. The film, about two feuding half-brothers, who both happen to be members of the US military, Michael Madsen, who started in a lot of B-shock over the years before getting a pretty decent shot in the arm for his career by starring Kill Bill as a Marine, and Chad McQueen as his naval airfighter pilot half-brother. By a stroke of coincidence, both brothers are assigned to the same aircraft carrier, despite not having seen each other for a good many years, in order to investigate a plot by a group of Iraqi soldiers to overthrow Saddam Hussein. or something like that, since the very weakly written script by Tony Giglio fails to adequately explain the purpose at all, sometimes even contradicting itself. When McQueen is shot down over Iraqi airspace, Madsen must go and rescue them. To be perfectly honest, Surface Air is not exactly a terrible movie, but not in any way making any effort to elevate itself above a D+ rating for me. For a 1990s B action, it's pretty surprisingly dull. Even the gunfights between the Marines and the Iraqi mutineers are very badly handled. The acting is reasonable. These are not novice actors dealing it, but seasoned B veterans who know how to do their roles in an efficient manner. It's also one of the 3 films of Miranda Wolf, an actress stunned 3 Royal Oaks films during the 1990s. She plays a reporter here, and in the last film, with Nautilus, she gets her only chance to play the hero. I'll review Nautilus in the future. And the stock footage is impressive enough. A reasonable choice for a weekend of binge watching for the fans of 1990s B action. Although, keep this one for viewing at an hour when you're not going to pay much attention to the TV screen. This was released onto both Flashback Entertainment and Ram Multimedia during the El Cheapo label's reign of the late 2000s and on the cusp of the 2010s. The DVDs of this film have pretty average picture quality. Black Dragons, directed by William Nye, 1942. I gave this a D+. This is available on various public domain DVD releases. There's even some Blu-rays, restore prints available overseas. This third entry in the infamous 1940s Monogram 9 was rushed into production by Monogram right after the Japanese surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, and was released onto American cinema on the 6th of March 1942. The film was Lugosi's first and only spy thriller, and by this point he was already addicted to morphine and was gripped by some very bad arthritis, yet Lugosi never let it sap his energy. Right before the USA entered into World War II against the Nazis and Imperial Japanese, the Nazis hired the Doctor to do some work for the Black Dragon Society, a group of Japanese agents who were planning to plant some insiders into the US's industrial complex so they can do some dastardly fifth column sabotage. For those who don't know, the fifth column is a term used to describe hostile agents who go into a target country and as spies and subvert the country's nation-state they were residing in other words, inside agents. Basically sabotage work. 6 Japanese agents are selected for the mission to have plastic surgery done to them so they could resemble the 6 American industrialists who were captured and killed so the imposters can take their place. The Doctor is then sent to a prison to avoid the plan ever being discovered. But the Doctor gets a change of heart and switches places with a lookalike in order to break out, track down spies one by one so he can ice them off himself. Black Dragons isn't really a good film. Indeed, it's one of the weaker films in the series. But you have to understand the context in which this was made in. It was World War II, and the USA had just suffered a massive attack by the Japanese in Pearl Harbor, fast forcing them into the war. Hollywood then decided to do their bit for the war effort, and just about every studio was hard at work popping out propaganda features, this was Monogram's entry into that market. As such, the film does its job modestly well, even though it's pretty rough to sit through. Why is it rough? Well, the technical side of things are pretty poor, given that Monogram was one of the cheapest studios around. Also of note is that the script was obviously rushed into production in an insanely quick manner, even though the film was set back a few weeks, and the events on the screen don't make too much sense. I thought the idea of getting spies to be transformed into the people they're meant to replace was a little intriguing, although how would you manage to change their voices convincingly? Anyway, the direction is lacking a fair bit, and Lugosi doesn't get too much of the attention, but it does his usual good work. Lugosi was a consummate professional. He never let the cheap budget sap his energy. Now, The Ape Man, directed by William One-Shot Birdie in the year 1943. I gave this one a D. It's bad. It's also available on various public domain sources, like pretty much all of them on Monogram 9. Now, you gotta feel sorry for poor Bela, but at this point he was pretty much accepting any job he can get in order to get the drug money he so desperately needed for his addiction to morphine. And according to rumors, he was apparently quaffing formaldehyde because it was the only stuff that still had an effect on him. Poor bastard. And the Ape Man, the 6th of the Monogram 9, Bela was reduced to wearing fake ape fur on his head and face and hands in order to portray a mad scientist who is in his quest to study evolution, takes a potion and turns into a human ape. That still looks like a kind of werewolf in places. Anywho, Bela needs human spinal fluid in order to regain his human form, but in order to do that he needs to kill his victims. However, medical science has evolved significantly since the days of the early 1940s, while the people back then didn't know sweet fuck all about what they were doing, judging by what happens here. The film was directed by legendary hack William Bodine, known as One Shot due to his habit of shooting so fast and cheap that he only needed one take for each scene. This is the same guy who gave the world Jesse James Meets Frankenstein's Daughter, and reportedly directed more than 250 films, many from the silent era. The lack of polish due to Mr. One Shot's habits does a fair job of rendering whatever atmosphere this unholy bugger might have had practically useless, and a strange fourth wall-breaking mysterious character who shows up from time to time and reveals himself to be the film's author, before cranking up the car window with the words "The End" printed on it. It's probably the strangest thing I've seen in a 1940s movie. The film doesn't seem to have it being taken seriously, so if you're in the mood for some laughs, this might fit the bill. That was some pretty bad stuff. Now, that was the second part of D Spectrum 4. The third part will be the end of this special, and I hope you will tune in to see the final 5 films in this list of craptacular films I've been covering so far. I mean, the D Spectrum will keep on going, but just for number 4, this is the next one will be the last. Now, hope you guys are staying safe. Take all the precautions you need to stop the coronavirus, and that's it for this review.